I'm now very excited to introduce two speakers from Ideo, Tom Ike and Susan O'Malley. Tom is Chief Technology Officer and Partner at Ideo. He has led the Consumer Experience Design practice and served as Chief Build Officer for Ideo's development across all locations and practices. Susan is a co-lead of the Talent Studio, a team working to reframe how we think about design and design processes associated with recruiting and human resources. Now let's hear from Tom and Susan.
Thanks, Tatiana.
Thanks, Tatiana. It is such a great honor to take us home today after all the fantastic content that we've heard over the next couple of hours. By way of some additional context, in my current role, as Tatiana mentioned, I help clients think about strategy, organizational design, and talent. And increasingly in this moment right now, that means helping companies think about both the near and far future of work and what kinds of systems and practices they're going to bring into place to be the best version of themselves in the future. I feel incredibly fortunate that I'm getting to sense make and learn and design right now with some of the world's most impressive organizations as they seek to understand what worked and was learned during the past 16 months. While it might sound corny, I also just want to put it right out there and say that I'm particularly excited about the choices and opportunities we have in this moment. In the 20 years of my professional career, I don't believe there's ever been a moment when it's been more important to think about the assumptions and the defaults that we had in our work. Many of the themes that Tom and I explore today will build on content from earlier in the day, from Tatiana and Adam Grant in particular, and we're particularly excited to talk about tactical and practical opportunities that stand in front of us. Let me hand it to Tom, who's going to tell you a little bit about his background and why he's excited to be here.
Thanks, Susan. I am excited to be here. I'm in charge of tech at Ideo, and I'm the kind of tech leader that actually hates tech. Well, I don't hate it. I don't waste emotion on it. I really don't. I never did, even when I was a mechanical engineer doing product design in my early days at Ideo using parametric CAD tools. I just could not be bothered to waste emotion on them. And so I think it gives me the qualifications for my job that are helpful in this era of abundance, because I meet a lot of our end users or people that are passionate one way or the other about all the flood of apps and tools coming at us that Tatiana cited earlier. And it just seems like there's ever more every year, especially in the past pandemic year.
Yeah, awesome. And to pull that together, I think on my side, what's particularly exciting as a talent practitioner and an organizational design leader is to think about how IT, L&D, how these systems come together. Most people are very conscious of the fact that they have a tech stack and that they should be making intentional choices about what they're using, how they pay for it, how to make it as awesome as possible. Very few people are as mindful thinking about the people stack. What is the talent stack and the human stack? And how do all of the systems and processes that we put in place to support our work ladder up to an awesome system and choice? So the first piece of thinking that Tom and I wanted to put out there, and so on our format for today, Tom and I are going to bounce a few ideas off each other and call out sort of what we've been seeing and what we're learning in this moment, and then we're going to go back to Tatiana and do some dialogue and Q&A at the end. The first piece of thinking that we wanted to put out there was this fantastic visual from Matt Mullenweg that emerged pretty early in the pandemic. So it's been out there for quite a while. Matt Mullenweg, many of you may know, is the founder of Automattic and WordPress. He's a phenomenal thought leader on the future of work, distributed teams. And if you're not familiar with Matt's work, I definitely recommend checking that out in the future. The thing that I think is so powerful about this visual is that he kind of simplifies a range of levels that a company might be operating on, from fully centralized in person and tightly sort of coiled and managed up to something that he calls level 5, which is probably too idealized, something that might be a nirvana where the most high performing organization in the world seamlessly works and coordinates together. And the reason that I wanted to come back to this visual from the early pandemic is to anchor our thoughts a little bit in the fact that we are now processing so many of the lessons and mistakes and learnings that our organizations have made. I think it's really helpful to revisit this visual and think about where we've landed. So to give you a concrete example, at the very beginning of the pandemic, most companies were operating at somewhere between a level 1 and a level 2 organization. They might have had some flexibility for remote teams or working for the employees, but for the most part, they were heavily anchored in-person processes and practices together. overnight, companies had to jump from level 2 to level 3. And for the most part, unless they were in an essential sector industry, they were fortunate to be able to work from home and to think about how their processes and workflow could adapt to the fully distributed environment. I think that right now, many organizations are still grappling at going from level 2 to level 3. Some, of course, are making mistakes and assuming that they're going to be a level 4 fully distributed company and bringing in some of those practices. And sometimes there's a tension there or a struggle to do that properly. But the point I want to make here is that this framework is a phenomenal tool to think about where your organization is right now, where it's been when it's been thriving over the past couple of months, and also as you make these policy choices for your digital workplace, where do you ideally want to be? I'm going to pass it to Tom in a second for his builds on this framework, but the one thing I want to call out here is that the goal is not for everybody to try to be a level 5 or even a level 4 organization. The goal is that you find the thing that is most authentic to your culture and that can help your employees deliver on your work purpose, and that you design that with intention. Tom, how does this framework resonate with you? What have you been seeing in its use over the past 6 months?
Well, it scares me, Susan, to be honest, because to cite some of the examples that were given previously, I'm in the role of spending our IT budget, and it's a lot of money. And I may make some big bets to try to get us to a higher level that could be quite wrong and put us down a capital expense cul-de-sac that we can't pull out of easily. So I think this is fascinating. I really admire Matt Mullenwake's commentary, which you may have heard in a podcast he did with Sam Harris, about the fact that what it does implies is that we are going to come together in physical space, but for very good and different reasons than we've done reflexively and automatically in the past. And I don't think we've found all those reasons yet.
Yes, absolutely. And one point I want to underscore there, Tom, is that, as we start to return back and design our hybrid or our flexible policies, we are inherently seeing most people realize that the future has to be a digital workplace. If we have any degree of flexibility in terms of supporting employees working from home, we cannot return to the old biases of informal, ad hoc, in-person policies. The employee experience has gotten almost fully digital overnight. And most companies are not understanding that this is a big choice that steps ahead of them in terms of how they think more intentionally about the digital workplace. Tom, back to you. I believe you've got a next exposition for us to push our thinking here.
Yeah, and just to the point you just made, I'll say that there is something that Matt Mullenwake gets at that I do miss, that is, what are the good things in those serendipitous interactions that we do miss when we're not together in a space? We still haven't found them all. And I've been on some forced Zoom social calls that just have been better or worse, but I just don't think they're there yet. Okay, so I'm going to go back in time. Some of you may know this is a French-Italian film, actually a series of films this character was in, named Monsieur Hulot. And this is about The Office. This is a very French existential story of his ennui at being unmoored in a having escapades and clashes with technology in a world that was increasingly automated and increasingly baffling. And he actually thinks he's going into a workspace, but he's actually going to a trade show that sells workspace cubicles. And since I worked on workspace cubicles when I joined Ideo 25 years ago, I particularly enjoyed this one. But my point in sharing it with you is that if this was the past, actually things haven't changed, they've gotten worse. So go to the next slide, if you would, Susan. And instead of getting lost in a maze of disguised room and offices and eventually stumbling into maybe where you want to go or where you didn't want to go, now we're being presented with ever more options. And you could think of these as places. I do. I think spatially. I think a lot of you probably do. And yet they are really hard for people to context shift into, to be invited into even, or to even with a very curated approach, know their role or how they're supposed to show up or what they're supposed to do and when they're supposed to do it. And again, I think you've all been experimenting with this as we have in the past year or so. I want to share an example of a story. Every year we do a big convening company-wide. A year ago, May, we did a collaging exercise, which creative leaders and designers created. And they originally came to me, wanted to use an app, which I will not name, which is a very high-powered parametric interaction design and prototyping modeling app. And they wanted the entire company to have access to it its editor's licenses, which is impossible. It would have cost too much money. Nobody would know how to use it. It would be a disaster. After we discussed it, they reverted to Google Slides. We're in the Googleverse. And they created all the clip art that people were using for collaging. They created the event and the experience. And it was the most fantastic experience I've had, maybe ever, of flow at scale across hundreds of participants. Breakout rooms were used to share. There were hundreds of people in the convening when we come back together. And it was just a promise of what we might get to. And if we think about it, rather than being abstract collaging around thematic prompts we were given, if it could be about work, which easily could be, I think there's a path to a better future there for a virtual experience. This year, actually, the team that did it brought in some VR, and it just felt like a different place. It didn't feel like the same place, and we lost the flow, in my opinion. So I just wanted to share that real quickly. The thing that I think we always look at IDEO is what is the end user experiencing, and what are their expectations, and how are they equipped to handle whatever experience they're being asked to engage with. And the problem with a lot of the apps that are coming my way anyway, and we've always been a bring your own tech kind of company, so people are self-serving apps into the company that are taking off like a virus. The problem is they're really designed for the end user UX, not for the enterprise, not for the admins, not for the L&D people. And yes, they may have good building help pages for people to go find. People don't go find them. And often it's the power user that's pulling the least powerful user in, and it's not only inequitable, but it's actually a big waste of time and money at the end of the day when, for example, you'll see people using that high-powered parametric interaction prototyping app instead of just a whiteboarding app. And they should be just using a whiteboarding app if they're just whiteboarding. So one of the things that I really resonate with, which was said earlier by Tatiana, is the tight binding that needs to happen between learning and development, talent, and tech, but it also needs to engage business ownership at every level. I think the biggest failure that I'm seeing is that people will not take ownership. They are victims to tech. And again, I not only refuse to invest my emotions in tech, I do not want to be a slave to it. So I reject that. And our experiments in how to not be that slave to tech, but how to actually be in charge of it, and how to move forward in a hybrid future we know is coming, are really works in progress. I will say this, though, that for the future that I believe we'll have to grapple with, as well as many of you, we will have some percentage on and some percentage off-prem. And so we have to have and be mindful of those different modes and find those reasons, as Matt Mullenweg challenged us to come together in space, whether physical or digital.
I love it, and I appreciate the real talk from our head of technology. I think if you haven't had a coffee or a pint with your head of technology recently, it's a good time to check in about this type of dialogue. The other thing I want to call out, which Tom hit on, is, in many companies, we're seeing that folks from the L&D department, the talent department, the HR department, maybe they're used to interacting on systems of record, some of these sort of technical, very binary, important backend systems, ERPs. I won't name them, but the sort of software that maybe HR people love to use, that employees sometimes really don't find that delightful. And so we need to not just think about the systems of record here, but actually the systems of engagement, because there's a massive design opportunity to think about how we can make the digital workplace really work for the employees. And oftentimes on this visual, people they can't even really easily think about how those teams would come together and collaborate in the way that Tom just described. Awesome. So I'm going to share one final framework, and then we're going to go over to Tatiana for a little bit of dialogue. I'm going to leave this on the screen for a moment. This is what we call the core four. And I'd like you all just to read these words and sit with them for a moment and have a little think to yourself about how much you're thinking about them right now in designing the near-term future of work, in designing your digital workplace. Okay, maybe stuff is bubbling up for people, some of them obvious. Maybe some of them less obvious. Okay, so where we're going to take this is I've actually pulled together a 2x2, not just because I'm an MBA for my sins, but because I really enjoy simple frameworks and tools that we can use, with a pen and paper or on our computer with a cup of coffee. And the thing that I'm really getting at here is some provocations that I'm seeing right now in the work that I'm doing that are often very overlooked by sponsors and senior leaders in organizations. And it's not just these 4 T's that I'm going to walk us through, but it's actually the interplay, the connection, and the tension between them that I think presents a tremendous opportunity in this time. The first one task I'm going to talk about is this need to question our defaults and our assumptions about the fundamental nature of the work that our employees are doing to support the mission of the company. And so the thing here is that, in designing our digital workplace and our hybrid policies and our flexible policies, we're actually failing to have real concrete, obvious dialogue about what the nature of the things the employee is doing are and how we can best support them. And so to give you a couple of concrete examples, we might have a product or a design organization that needs to get together, that works through charrettes, that prefers a kind of a heavily in-person environment where possible. But they may also have handovers to engineers who actually love being able to go heads down and have long blocks of uninterrupted time to develop products and really make things. And we can already start to imagine and understand the types of workplace policies that can make life even better for those employees. On the other side of the scale, though, we might have a big field organization. We might have salespeople, we might have customer support agents, and it might actually be far better to bring those people together for kickoffs, gatherings, sales meetings. It might be better to have them traveling sustainably to see clients on the road. And so where I'm going with this is, many companies are actually not doing enough questioning and thinking about the fundamental nature of the work that they're doing and what the opportunity means in this moment in time. And if you're curious about this one, there's a fantastic piece by Linda Grattan, which was in the HBR cover story a couple of months ago. The article is called Doing Hybrid Right, and she gives some really actionable examples that leaders can do about redesigning task-based work. The second area that I'm going to talk about is the intersection of trust and team. And there's two quick points I'd make here. The first is that if we step back and think about all the news headlines we're seeing right now, all the backlash about employee policies, and Goldman Sachs wants this and Google wants that and Twitter wants the other, really, trust is at a lot of the center of these questions, and in particular, leaders' trust and leaders' preferences for what they want themselves in terms of their own assumptions about how work should work, their own nostalgia for the things that they liked in the past or that they want in the future. And I'll be a little bit edgy on this one and just say that if you don't feel like your leadership team or your board is having the kinds of real talk conversations about where their assumptions about trust are coming from, I invite you to challenge them on that. Maybe the intentions are coming from a really positive place, or maybe there's a bunch of outmoded, very personal preferences driving this. I highly encourage you to sit down and talk about that, facilitate an offsite, or call me if you need help setting up that conversation. The other one I want to say here is that if you look at a lot of the literature and research on the most successful hybrid teams or distributed teams, we also see parts of this people stack that support the development of trust coming up time and time again. So a great one to look at here is a thing called launch meetings that Tadal Neely talks about in her book, Remote Work Revolution. She's a Harvard professor that publishes widely on this topic. And they really talk about creating the conditions for trust to come together in these teams. There's also a lot been published on agreements by the and at Ideo, we have our own system called the Flights Toolkit, which is what we use to make sure that we're not just setting up trust, but that we're maintaining trust over a long period of time. Last of all, I want to talk about the intersection of time and team. This is probably one of the most critical things that we have to get right as we move into the near future. The big idea here, and many of the speakers have hit on it today, is thinking about which parts of the work should be done in a synchronous live context, either in person or on calls and meetings, and which parts are best handled in an asynchronous fashion. Getting the handovers and the contributions of team members correct relative to time is probably one of the single biggest opportunities available to us. And Adam Grant hit this right on the head earlier when he threw out that phenomenal but disturbing fact about how many employees are spending more than half their time in meetings when they might be better placed focusing on other task-based work in the future. We've been experimenting a lot with Loom, with voicemail. There are other lots of other types of systems that you can use here that I think can really unlock productivity and collaboration thinking at the intersection of what needs to be live and what can be asynchronous. Last of all, I'm going to talk for a second about time and task. Time is the one for me that gets the most personal. I think that how people spend their time at work and how that time feels is probably one of the single biggest levers that we can have on employee happiness and well-being. One of my favorite philosophers and coaches, a guy called Gay Hendricks, in his book, The Big Leap, he talks about this concept of Einstein time. And the whole idea behind Einstein time is that time is relative. If we're doing something that we enjoy, spending time with a friend or a family member, or having an activity where we have flow, an hour a day can fly by in a minute. and we actually don't even really understand our sense of time because we're enjoying it and feeling like it's productively used. If, on the other hand, we're in a painful situation, maybe we're trapped on a hot iron, or we're in a really frustrating meeting that's going on forever, that 10 minutes or that hour can last forever. And so thinking about how we use time and tasks to really energize our employees as much as possible is one of the biggest opportunities that we have. Allocating the right amount of time to them and understanding people's individual preferences. Tom, am I crazy? What's going on? Anything bubbling up for you here?
You're good. You're good, Susan. I think watching the clock, I want to hand it back to Tatiana. Obviously, we could go on and on about these topics, but thank you. That was excellent.
That was amazing. And so I wanted to kind of follow up a little bit on, Tom, you mentioned that there was a proliferation of apps across Ideo, and I want to kind of overlap that with the move to our autonomy, right? And so how do you manage in a company that values human-centeredness and autonomy and this proliferation of people just buying app after app? I mean, does it feel out of control, and how do you balance that?
Yeah, it does at times. I mean, I write articles that I hope the company reads and refers to about how to think about, hey, you're bringing in a new tool. You're the buyer. You're the owner. Here's how you need to think about it. If you want it to scale, you have to help others to use it, and then bring in IT to see if it makes sense to scale, bring in talent. And it's a dance, right? Because a lot of what we have to do is reactive, and policing never works entirely. So the other thing we have to do is get on the front end and say, with the influencers, what are we doing? What do we need to do that we're not able to do right now? What's the next app that'll get us there? And the problem with that, I think, is that, just as I said earlier, making big bets is really hard in this environment because, to your point, Tatiana, we're being asked to make many bets.
Yeah. Yeah, and following up also on this notion of time, and how do you, and this idea of policing, right? I mean, I think that one of the things that we talk about a lot is efficiency, 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 and there you kind of feel like time is being policed all the time. And how do we think about that in a more autonomous, autonomy-driven, sort of purpose-driven workplace? How do we intersect those things?
Susan, you might want to take that. I will say that we are using Focus Fridays increasingly across the firm, no Zooms, and no minimal scheduling.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, Tatiana, and I don't think I think certainly many of the tools we've talked about today help. For me, I'm really seeing that it's the frontline Google Calendar or Outlook choices. Do leaders have the energy to step back, to reflect? Are they backed up by fantastic coordination teams? So I think there's a lot more we can be doing about time choices. Think back to Adam Grant's comment earlier. We also need to step back and analyze how we're using time and think about new ways that we can be better supporting our goals on a quarterly and an annual basis with time.
I will observe in remote work, I've seen meetings get removed or de-scoped or just reduced in time, which I really like, because we were just using time because we were face-to-face. And when we're not face-to-face, it's more precious and we don't.
Indeed. Indeed, time is so precious. And thank you both for spending your time with us and sharing with us some of the trends that you're seeing and some of the ways that Ideo is helping both itself and its clients, right, work through this incredible transformational moment. So thank you both.
Thank you.
All right. So that's a wrap. It's the end of the Guide Conference, and thank you so much for joining us. We are thrilled you spent this time with us exploring digital adoption, and we look forward to many more opportunities to engage with you. With that in mind, a quick announcement that Pendo's annual conference, Pandemonium, will take place this October 13th and 14th in Raleigh, North Carolina, and virtually online. We hope to see you there. Thank you again for joining, and have an awesome day.